Hi, anatomy students. This is Mrs. Hallman, and this is the second screencast, part two, muscles of our biomechanic unit. The first screencast was about bones, and the last screencast will be about joints. Today, we're going to break this into two parts. The first part will go over naming protocols, anatomy of muscles, and some common physiology of muscles. The second part of the screencast, we're going to go over common disorders of the muscular system. So, as a quick intro, there are over 650 muscles in the human body. These muscles are in charge of locomotion. We're going to just study the most common muscles for large movements. We're going to also study the muscles that are homologous between humans and cats. Learning names of muscles is a little trickier than the names of bones simply because they're longer and they can be more difficult to remember. The key really is once you learn some basic naming conventions, you find some common terms and you start to recognize patterns in these names, naming muscles does get a little bit easier. Muscles are named after some very common terms. So muscles can be named after the shape that they take. So for example, deltoids are triangles and orbicularis is going to be a muscle that is circular or orbits something. They can be named after the size, so major, minor, or vastus refers to how large or small that muscle is. They can be named after the location, so dorsi means backside, or infra or supra are both prefixes that means upper and lower, superior and inferior. They can also be described where they fall or how long they are. So when you see these common terms, it gives you a clue on where those muscles are found. Lastly, it can also be named after what that muscle is going to do for locomotion. Is it going to be an extensor or a flexor? Right? They can also be named or at least give you a clue on what attachment site they have for moving the bone. So they can be named after the region that they're attached. So for example, biceps femoris. Biceps is referring to a two-headed muscle, but it's a connecting muscle to the femur bone, which gives you a clue about why that's named that way. Another really good example of that is there's a muscle called extensor carpi radialis longus. So if you break that down, yeah, it sounds like a long, confusing name, but if you break it down, it's simply a long muscle that is going to be parallel to the radius bone. It's going to connect the through the carpals, and it's going to work on extending the fingers. So all four parts of that term give you a clue on what it is. As a very quick review for those students who have had Anatomy 1 and a brief introduction for those AP Bio students joining us for Anatomy 2, there are three different types of muscle. There's skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Skeletal is going to be striated, which means it has perpendicular stripes. It's under voluntary control of our nervous system, whereas smooth is going to be involuntary. It's more controlled by our autonomic nervous system. And our cardiac, again, is under involuntary control. It's going to be striated branching muscle cells. All right, so we see that striation in skeletal tissue mostly. All right, you do not need to memorize the following terms. I just wanted to introduce you that the idea is that we name muscles after the arrangement of the fiber. If you've ever eaten like steak or chicken, you'll notice that there's a kind of a grain or a direction that that tissue follows. And we can name muscles or categorize them into the way that they are arranged. So for example, there are these things called parallel muscles. Great example of that would be the sartorius muscle, which is very long and parallel. There are convergent muscles that converge on one tendon, like the pectoralis. There are pinnate muscles. Penna, actually, that root word means feather, so they kind of have a stem running through the center and they branch off on either side. There are bipennate, unipennate, multipennate. Then there are circular muscles, and we see those usually around the eyes, ears, the mouth, any of the sphincters of our body. We also use the terms origin and insertion in reference to our muscles. The origin is always going to be the immobile end of the muscle. So I like to think that is kind of like our anchor. Then the insertion is going to be the point that it's attached to that's going to be doing the moving. All right, so a great example of that is in our biceps brachii. The origin is going to be at the top of the shoulder and on that part of the scapula. And the insertion point is going to be on the ulna and the radius, so that lower or the upper forearm. And that's going to be what allows us to contract that muscle and to move. We also will classify each muscle in terms of its advantage to our body. All right, so what do I mean by advantage? Well, in physics class, we learned that there are 3 different types of lever that help us move things. And we classify that lever as always having a fulcrum, which is the pivot, a load, which is the weight that it has to lift, and then the effort, right? So how is that upward force applied? Well, in terms of biomechanics, the effort is always going to be applied by that muscle. All right, so the muscle is going to provide the effort. The load is going to be the part of the skeleton that you are trying to move. And the pivot or the fulcrum is going to be the joint of that skeleton. So we can look at the 3 different types of levers, first, second, and third. First class lever, I should say they are all named by the thing that falls in the center of the lever arm. So first class lever, you can see the fulcrum or the pivot is in the center. So the first class lever is named after the fulcrum being in the center. Second class levers are named because the resistance or the load is in the center. And third class have the force or the effort in the center. So we can see examples of first, second, and third class levers in our body, and we work with this concept in a lab in our class called the Bones as Lever Lab, where we'll go through and classify different bones in your body. First class lever, a great example of that is when you're nodding your head. All right, you have an access point on the atlas bone of your body. Your resistance would be the side of your head that you're trying to raise up. And then the force would be the back trapezius muscles of your neck. Second class second class lever is going to be when the resistance is in the center. So your calf muscle or your gastrocnemius muscle is going to condense. That's going to be your upward force on the end of your lever arm. Then we have the resistance in the middle. That would be where your tibia and your fibia are distributing the weight of your upper body. And then, of course, the pivot or the access point is going to be the pad of your foot where you're pushing off of that up onto your tippy toes. That's a second class lever. And then the third class lever, the best example of that is our biceps. So we have our fulcrum or our axis right there on our elbow, on our lower humerus. We have the upward force of our biceps brachii, and then of course the resistance or the load is going to be whatever you're trying to lift when you contract that muscle. Each of these is going to have different advantages in our body. Second and third class levers are best when we need to lift things. First class levers are really good when we need to balance things. So a first class lever is not the best, a first class lever is not the best when you want to move things quickly or to move a great distance, but it's really good when you need to make small, fine adjustments because it's a very balanced lever. Whereas a third class lever is not the most mechanical advantage that you can have from that lever, meaning it's not that effective of a lever. But the reason why our body has a lot of these third class levers is that it does help with the length of that movement. So our legs and our arms, a lot of our appendicular skeleton uses third class levers because they give us the advantage of having a long distance movement as opposed to shorter movements. When we talk about skeletal muscle is going to be accompanied with a couple other parts of our anatomy. So skeletal muscles are going to be innervated with nerve tissue. They're going to be vascularized with blood and blood vessels. And then they're going to have different connective tissues that help organize them and keep them aligned. There are 3 main types of connective tissues we'll talk about. We'll talk about fascia a lot. That's going to be a very strong but thin connective tissue that will cover the outsides of the muscles, or it will protect that muscle from when it would slide against a bone. So fascia really is just meant to protect the muscle from friction and from damage when it moves. Tendons are going to be used to attach the muscle to bone to help with locomotion. And then an aponeuroses, these are going to be very thin but strong stretches of fascia that are going to cover bone. They also might kind of make a blanket covering between two larger muscles. So for example, we have an aponeuroses on this part of our skull. If you kind of feel your skull, there's not a whole lot of padding between your skull and the skin on top of it. There's no muscle, there's no real fat. Um, the thing that is going to protect those bones and be an attachment site of the frontalis muscles here in your forehead is this thing called the aponeuroses. Again, it's a connective tissue. Another example of this is in our abdominal muscles. So we have fascia that connects those abdominal muscles in that, cliche 6-pack or 8-pack abs. There's fascia in between them that help attach so that those contracting muscles have something to kind of tug on in order to make flexion of the upper body or the torso. So a really good reminder is that this fascia is going to separate muscles. Now this is found in the bottom part of our foot. We have a piece of fascia that is called our plantar fascia. It connects from the heel of the foot to the pad of the foot. And I do apologize, that picture is a little graphic, but that's actually the plantar fascia being removed from a foot. In the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can also see fascia on like a chicken wing. When you eat chicken, you have to separate the chunks of the fibrous skeletal muscle, and they're separated by fascia. You might recognize the term plantar fascia from a really common condition called plantar fasciitis. Again, if we kind of fall back on our knowledge of prefixes and suffixes, anytime you have itis in a term, it means swelling or inflammation. So plantar fasciitis, found very common in runners and athletes and endurance athletes specifically, is when you have repeated impact on the heel of the foot. Repeated impact means that you're going to place strain on that plantar fascia, and it's going to damage the fascia and cause pain and inflammation. Best ways to kind of overcome that would be to stretch out that fascia so it's not so tight on the bottom of your foot, and therefore there won't be that strain when you repeatedly step on it in a running motion. Now, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. We've been talking about muscles really on the organ system and the organ level. Let's start talking about them on the tissue and the cellular level. So muscles are arranged in a collection of parallel fibers, and we gather these fibers into bundles. So these fibers that are running in the same direction are called fascicles. So you can see that in that image, there's probably about a dozen fascicles that make up that one muscle. Each fascicle layer is connected and kind of contained by a layer of tissue. So the layer of tissue on the outside of the muscle is called the epimysium, and then the perimysium and the endomysium. The fascicle would be those little collections of fibers on the inside. Now, this is a really good point for us to kind of remember that when we talk about a muscle fiber, that's the same thing as me saying a muscle cell. Excuse me. So when we are looking at the cells that make up muscle tissue, we also call them muscle fibers. All right, so a little deep dive into the cells of muscles. Muscle cells, so right now on the screen, we're looking at one muscle cell. All right, we know that because it's labeled in the top as a muscle fiber. These cells in the skeletal system are going to be multinucleated. So we can see there's 1, 2, 3 nuclei, and it's surrounded by this thing called a sarcolemma. That's the cell membrane of that muscle cell. On the inside, we have some common organelles that we know from other cells. We have, of course, lots of little mitochondria that will make the ATPs that we need to go through cell respiration and give us energy to contract those muscles. We also have sarcoplasm. All right, so again, your little anatomy ears should be perking up that you see a prefix in two terms that are referring to muscles. So you see that prefix sarco. Sarcolemma is the lining of the muscle cell, the cell membrane. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm inside of a muscle cell. Inside of that muscle cell, we have myofibrils. All right, so those myofibrils are going to be the small contracting unit that actually do the mechanism of contracting the muscles. And what we're going to see on this really fun video is that those contracting elements of a muscle cell will actually contract even if they're not connected to a brain that triggers them to contract. So this video shows freshly harvested frog legs that were skinned, and then they just sprinkled them with salt. So it sounds super weird, but you can see what's starting to happen is even though those muscles are not connected to a frog, they are still relatively fresh muscles, meaning they still have all the nutrients they need to contract.
That's freaky.
The only thing they're lacking is a nervous system. And
Ellen, check this out.
by sprinkling salt on them, you're triggering the sodium potassium channels that would actually be the same channels that a nervous impulse would trigger them. So it kind of mimics your brain telling them to contract. So it's kind of fun. You can like watch them dance even though they're not connected to anything. All right, so in AP Bio, you guys learned a lot about the steps of a nerve firing a signal to another nerve. So you learned the process of this thing called an action potential. In Anatomy 1, we talked about this process as well. So we're just going to kind of briefly run over it. We're not going to dive too deeply into it at this level. To remind you to kind of dust off the cobwebs of the key anatomical players, this entire thing is called a neuromuscular junction. Okay, it is the junction, the connection between the nervous system and the muscular system. So this yellow nerve is going to connect one of its dendrites onto the outside coat of a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. You'll notice that this is going to be a motor neuron because it's telling a muscle to move, therefore it's classified as a motor neuron. You'll also notice that if we zoom into one of these neuromuscular junctions, in cross-section, we can see that the end part of the dendrite of that neuron, our presynaptic terminal, is going to have these little vesicles. And those vesicles are going to contain a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter, when it is connecting a nerve to a muscle, is always acetylcholine. So you can also see there's some mitochondria in there, and you can see that it's going to have a small space between the end of that presynaptic terminal and the cell membrane of that muscle. So that space is called the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter will travel across that synaptic cleft, and it will bind with one or more receptors on the sarcolemma. Okay. So this is presynaptic terminal, and this is the postsynaptic membrane. All right, so in a nutshell, again, just reviewing our key players, the steps of the neuromuscular junction are going to be that first, that nervous impulse or the action potential travels down the axon and the dendrite to this presynaptic little button, this presynaptic terminal of our neuron. That action potential, through a couple really cool mechanisms, is going to trigger these little tiny vesicles to travel to the outside of this presynaptic terminal and release through exocytosis their neurotransmitter. Again, that's going to be acetylcholine. That's what number 7 is right here, the little acetylcholine. And that little molecule is going to diffuse across that synaptic cleft, which is number 4 here, that space, and it's going to land on acetylcholine receptors. All right, and that's what's labeled number 6 here. Those acetylcholine receptors are then going to take that impulse, transmit it across the sarcolemma, and eventually that's going to lead to a muscle contraction. Okay, bunch of other physiology that happens behind that movement, but we'll just review it very quickly there. So that leads us to our next term, which is a motor unit. This is a term that refers to a single neuron and all of the fibers that that one neuron can control. So in this image, this brings about a kind of cool topic. In this image, we can see that there are 2 motor neurons. Here's motor neuron 1 and motor neuron 2. This motor neuron has 1, 2, 3 branches, and you can see that those branches go to different fibers or different cells within one muscle. So what that means is that one motor neuron can actually trigger or fire different muscle fibers in different areas. You say, why is this important? Well, when we work out, we are building not just the strength of our muscles, but we're building a connection between our brain, our nervous system, and the muscular system. So the really great example of this is the first time that you ever tried to shoot a basketball. All right. If you've ever seen a little kid try to shoot a basket, it's hilarious. They're so bad at it, right? They're so bad at it. We laugh, but we love them. All right. They're so bad at it because their brain has not yet connected the correct motor neurons to the correct muscle fibers to complete that action. All right. Now, if that same little kid that looks so goofy trying to shoot a basket for the first time goes out and plays basketball for a couple hours each week and does that for years and years and years, every time that little kid is throwing that basketball, their nervous system is adding branches to the motor neuron. That motor neuron is then going to have a larger motor unit. And because of that, it's going to refine the dexterity of each movement. All right. Now we see this happen as children develop. So if you notice with babies when they're first born, they don't have really good motor control with their fingers. They don't have good fine motor control because they are still growing their nervous system. They're still developing their muscular system. So over time, their body will grow more networks of branches from each of their motor neurons. And those branches are going to reach out to more parts of the muscles in our body. And it's going to allow us to really fine tune which specific parts are fired of our muscles, which specific parts of our muscles are fired when. And that is exactly how we develop fine motor muscles and fine motor movements and fine motor actions. So this idea of a motor unit, meaning that anything that one neuron touches, that one motor neuron reaches out to, it kind of leads us to why it is that as athletes, we need to practice our actions to get muscle memory. 2 other terms that kind of apply to athletes and the muscular system is recruitment and muscle tone. So recruitment means that when you are doing a task, your body is pretty efficient. It's going to not waste energy unless it absolutely needs to. So anytime you do something like, let's say, pick up a water bottle, your body is only going to use the minimum amount of muscles that it possibly needs to do that action. Now, if I go to pick up the water bottle and it's extremely heavy, my body can then recruit more muscles to help in order to pick up that water bottle. All right. So basically, it's kind of a term that refers to your body being very efficient. It's going to not use all of the muscles unless it's deemed necessary. And that's a really smart thing because then we're not going to waste any more energy than we would need to. If we flip that on its head, if you're an athlete, you want to try to make your body go through recruitment. So if you think about what you do in the weight room, you typically don't lift an amount of weight that is easy for you, right? You want to lift an amount of weight that is challenging for your muscular system because it's going to trigger your body to go through recruitment. It's going to trigger your body to increase the amount of muscles that are being used and therefore give you more workout and increase your muscle mass. Another term that relates to athletes is muscle tone. So if you've ever done like a really, really hard core workout, like maybe crunches and, I don't know, oblique things, um, then when you are finished with that workout, if you feel the muscles in your abs, they are tight. And that is the term muscle tone. Basically, it means that those muscles have been working so hard, they haven't quite been able to relax completely. So they feel kind of toned. So that's what's actually happening physiologically. All right. The myofibrils inside of our body, again, we're not going to get into too much detail with this, but just know that myofibrils are inside of the muscle cells, inside of that muscle fiber. And there are two different kinds. There's actin and there's myosin. The actin and myosin make up these light and dark bands that we actually see under a microscope in that image to the right as the striations. So if you took Anatomy 1, we went through in our histology unit the striations of a skeletal muscle cell. What you were actually seeing were the strips of actin and myosin. All right, so let's look at what those actually do. The actin and the myosin are two different filaments inside of that muscle cell. The actin is going to be the thin filament, and the myosin is going to be the thick filament. And why that matters is that the actual like molecular level of a muscle contraction is caused because the myosin, which is here in the pink, makes these cross bridges, attaches to the actin, and then will actually contract and become shorter. All right. So each of those contractions are what is going to power movement in our skeleton. So just again, a quick overview on how that is. Some other terms that you'll probably hear about if you are pursuing nursing or kinesiology are terms hypertrophy and atrophy. All right, atrophy is whenever a muscle is not used commonly and it will actually kind of break down and become smaller and weaker. All right, again, muscles require a lot of energy. They are very expensive for our body to maintain and to keep alive. So if we're sitting around on the couch all day, if we don't need those muscles, our body's efficient, it's going to get rid of that muscle tissue, that muscle mass, so that it's not as expensive. It doesn't take as much energy to maintain. If we flip that on its head, anytime you work out, you are forcing your body into hypertrophy, meaning you're making those muscle cells tear and then repair themselves even bigger, which builds your muscle mass. All right. Muscle fatigue, muscle cramping, and oxygen debt have to do with what happens after you work out. Okay, so when you work out, your body is going through cell respiration, right? So remember back from freshman year bio. In cell respiration, you need oxygen, you need glucose, and you're going to release CO2 and water. Muscle fatigue is what's going to happen after you've been working out for a while and the glucose stores within your muscles have kind of depleted. When you run out of glucose that's stored in your muscles in the form of glycogen, you're no longer going to have that key ingredient, that key carbohydrate you need to break down for energy. So your muscles aren't going to have as many ATPs available and they're going to feel more tired. They're not going to be able to do as much effort. You usually reach fatigue after prolonged exercise. A muscle cramp is more physiological. A muscle cramp happens because the electrolytes that are needed for the contraction and the relaxation of a muscle is out of balance. Those electrolytes cause certain parts of your muscle to contract but not to relax. So if you've ever gotten like a Charlie horse in the back of your leg, near your calf muscle or your gastrocnemius, super painful, but it's due to an electrolyte imbalance. So have a banana that has some potassium in it or some strawberries. or maybe a little bit of Gatorade, and it should help with that cramping. An oxygen debt, right along the same line as muscle fatigue, is whenever you're working out, specifically cardiovascular activities or aerobic activities, and you cannot circulate oxygen quickly enough to that tissue, and therefore it starts going through anaerobic respiration. All right. And what that means is that it's going to create this stuff called lactic acid instead of ATP, or instead of the normal byproduct, which would be CO2. Um, and that lactic acid accumulates in the muscles. It's why your muscles get pink after working out, and it's why you get sore. Okay, so we are going to pause here. This is the first half of this muscle screencast. The second half, we're going to go over these conditions of the human muscular system.